Hello everyone, my name is 4AS and welcome to my channel. This is a series of video essays where I cover political, economic and revolutionary topics which are relevant to our time. I read the books, so you don't have to. In a world where money rules the land, there is one critique that is left unspoken. Integrity leads to innovation. Innovation leads to inequity. Inequity leads to insanity. Join me as we explore the four I's of capitalism. So let's jump right in. If you went up to the average person on the street and asked them about how they felt about socialism, you'd probably get a visceral response. I think everyone here in Australia remembers learning about Reds under beds in high school. To those of you who don't know, Reds under beds is a reference to the long-standing relationship of the Socialist and Communist Party in Australia and the campaigns to rid communism in the public consciousness. But first, a disclaimer. The idea of socialism is a very broad concept. It's kind of the reason Mr. Google has 3 separate definitions for it. So when people tell you this is socialism, always take it with a grain of salt. They most likely are inputting their own views and bias into what's being said. Heck, you can do that with me too. No one is 100% objective or perfect. Most people don't really know what socialism is, or at the very least, they know a failed example of a socialist state, so they just write it off. But what is socialism? Now, I want to go over 2 notions of socialism in the top of the video today. The first one refers to socialism in the context of our modern democratic political system. It affects your everyday life right now. Socialism is the policies or practices that affect politics and economics within society. To give a concrete example, you need not look any further than Medicare. Now, Medicare was a policy established on the 1st of February 1984 and was the establishment of basic health care for all Australians. According to Prime Minister Bob Hawke, with this historic initiative, all Australians now have a new, simpler and fairer health insurance system. Ask any Australian, they would feel horrified if in the next day they had to book an appointment at their local GP and afterwards the secretary says, "That'll be $7, thanks." That simply wouldn't fly here. Bulk billing your GP is part of the culture. I'm getting a strange sense of deja vu. Must be nothing. But don't take my word for it. George Orwell has very strong opinions about socialism. He said, "Socialism aims ultimately at a world state of free and equal human beings. It takes the equality of human rights for granted." With this in mind, we can see how a modern Australia can come up with such policies as the NDIS, the Rudd stimulus package, and JobKeeper, with the latter being implemented under a conservative government. It's a far cry from liberal thinking back in the 19th century. Except 1 or 2 Scrooges probably got a few more millions than they should have. But what about the second notion, I hear you ask? Well, that has to do with the government functions and its relation to people. In other words, instead of socialism being part of the system with certain policies, socialism is the political and economic system. Again, I think I might leave it to George Orwell to explain this one. Socialism is usually defined as common ownership of the means of production. Crudely, the state representing the whole nation owns everything and everyone is a state employee. This does not mean that people are stripped of private possessions, such as clothes and furniture, But it does mean that all productive goods, such as land, mines, ships, and machinery, are the property of the state. The state is the sole large-scale producer. Now, this quote touches on two misconceptions that I hear quite a lot about socialism. Mainly that, one, socialism wants to destroy our way of life, and two, socialism wants to take away people's property. The first point is a bit vague. I think what's being articulated here is the antagonism between capitalism and socialism on how businesses should be run. This is effectively what the means of production are. Businesses still function on assets, liabilities, expenses, and income. It's just one business, say a co-op, is run by the workers, whilst the for-profit company is run by the shareholders. I do have aspirations on doing a video on what a cooperative is, so we'll return to this topic another time. Then there's the second point. This is where a majority of people get confused about personal versus private property. Personal property is your clothes, furniture, and your home with the white picket fence, if you're into that sort of thing. Private property is where you casually visit your 12th investment property to charge your tenant $800 in weekly rent that you don't even need in the first place. The accumulation of capital as an end within itself. But in a way, I've been skirting around the issue. At this stage, it's important to go into a proper example of socialism as a political system. And there's no better way to do this than to discuss the 1917 revolution from Leon Trotsky's book, Permanent Revolution. Now, Russia in the beginning of the 20th century wasn't as technologically advanced as other countries in Europe, like, say, England or Germany. At this time, feudal leadership under the Tsar was still the norm in this Eastern European nation. And thanks to the earlier failed 1905 revolution, there was a lot of jockeying of power between the Tsar and various other factions, like Bolsheviks, capitalists in Russia, and so on. People who would be known as opportunists after the 1917 revolution. The Bolsheviks were a Russian leftist party in the 1900s, led by Vladimir Lenin. Russia, during this period, was a time of unrest and massive change. But there was one problem for the Bolsheviks. They were huge fans of Karl Marx and workers rising up once developing class consciousness. But there were little factories in the Russian landscape to realize the vision by Karl Marx. Class consciousness is an idea that ties into Karl Marx's theory based on workers in factories. The capitalist who owns the factory gains the profits off the workers' output. The idea here is the workers would rise up and seize the means of production after realizing they were being exploited for their work in the factories. So naturally, this is a bit of a pickle if there's no factories to begin with. However, Lenin and his lieutenants had a solution. As Trotsky writes, the realization of the revolutionary alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry is conceivable only under the political direction of the proletarian vanguard organized in the Communist Party. The proletariat were the workers involved in the factories and those who were involved in the full swing of the Industrial Revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks saw their socialist system as uniting the limited proletariat and the peasantry with a proletarian vanguard party, which leads to seizing the means of production and creating class consciousness amongst the people, which leads to the vanguard party handing over the means of production once the proletariat and peasantry were fully educated. The Bolsheviks and the intelligentsia within the party saw themselves as the spark to jumpstart the revolution. And this is unsurprising leading up to October 1917. Whilst Trotsky only joined the cause in the lead up to the October Revolution, party members were engaging the workers and peasants through councils called Soviets. There was unrest about the provincial Russian government during 1917, and the Bolsheviks were happy to capitalize. The peasant follows either the worker or the bourgeoisie. This means that the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry is only conceivable as the dictatorship of the proletariat that leads the peasant masses behind it. The Bolshevik way of running a political system bled into Leon Trotsky's further idea based on a global revolution policy. Lenin saw that Russia did not have a fully grown proletariat, and instead of fitting a square peg into a round hole, the party adapted their personal situation to Marxist and socialist ideology. Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin had become the lieutenants of Lenin post-1917, and the party was very much looking forward into the future. The conquest of power by the proletariat does not terminate the revolution, but only opens it. Socialist construction is conceivable only on the foundation of the class struggle, on a national and international scale. Russia had adopted the socialist vision to their personal situation. Leon Trotsky, with the global revolution policy, encouraged that socialist revolution and class consciousness need not end with Russia. Other countries would have to adapt socialism to their own personal situation. But it was Russia's duty to aid other countries in a global class struggle. But don't get me wrong, the Bolshevik system was flawed, and it ended up using authoritarian means to sustain its power when it eventually became the Soviet Union. But this was considered one of the first successful socialist political systems. It also poses an interesting what-if of what the world would have been like if, after Lenin's death, Trotsky got his way with a global revolution instead of Stalin's one-country policy. This effectively to keep socialism within Russia itself, an isolation policy, if you will. Now, if you thought that was interesting, then like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you are interested in learning more about the 1905 and 1917 revolution, I highly recommend you watch this guy called the Finnish Bolshevik. He goes into great detail about the revolution. I'll leave a link in the description. But remember, folks, keep thinking and keep learning. Goodbye till next time.